Welcome to episode 4 of No Blueprint. Toka Valu was born and raised in the South Pacific Kingdom of Tonga before migrating to the United States with his mother at age 14. His unique experience helped him develop a keen sense of awareness to empower students from elementary school to college. Today, Toka serves as the manager of student leadership programs at the University of Washington Samuel E. Kelly Ethnic Cultural Center. He is a proud Pacific Islander, youth advocate, community organizer, and artist in South King County. To see some of Toka's work, follow the links in the description. Also, we'd love to hear your feedback. Don't forget to subscribe, review, and rate our podcast. Follow No Blueprint on Twitter at No Blueprint Pod, Instagram at No Blueprint Podcast, Facebook, and on our website, noblueprintpodcast.com. Lastly, check out the playlist inspired by this podcast on Spotify. Peace.
How big New Zealand was compared to Tonga was always very appealing. And so I think that was instilled very early, and I always go, I'm not going to live in this country. I love where I'm from. I'm proud of where I came from, where my roots are. But I just knew that my life would be elsewhere.
What's up, everybody? I go by the name of Domo.
And I go by the name of Yoshiko.
And each week, we sit down with cultural ambassadors
To talk about how they defied societal norms
to live their lives
with no blueprint.
I was born in 1983 in Tonga. And for the first 14 years of my life, I spent it there in the islands. My dad was out of the picture before I was born. Not out of not wanting to take care of me, but out of responsibility, because he's the eldest in his own family, in his family of 8. And so he left the country to kind of help support them in New Zealand because their parents had picked up and left. And so things just didn't work out. And so I grew up without the dad around. And so mom was pretty much both mom and dad for the first 14 years of my life. And so in Tonga, it's a constitutional monarchy. And with that said, unlike Great Britain, the United Kingdom, which I forget which one it's called now, the king still holds majority of the power in our country. So appointing the cabinet of everyone who makes the laws, it's usually the king who appoints those folks. Having said that, there's a lot of things that left wanting for regular folks. And I grew up in a very pro-democracy type of family. That makes things a little interesting when it comes to Tonga's long-held history of bowing to authority, especially when it comes to nobility or the royal family. And my family kind of speaks their mind every now and then, a little too much.
So still to this day, there's a monarchy and there's a king and queen.
There is.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Oh wow. How long has the, kingdom been in existence?
That's a great question.
Since day one.
There's been 3 dynasties in our country. First dynasty was called the Tu'itonga dynasty, and that was established about 11 to 1200 years ago.
Oh wow. Okay.
And for about 600 years they ruled until it got to a point where that particular dynasty was considered too holy to kind of do everyday kind of governing. And so he assigned the governing to a second dynasty. And so while this dynasty kept all the honorifics and all the reverence of being godly, the Tu'ihatakalawa, which is the second dynasty, took over ownership of governing Tonga. And from that point, that's when Tonga actually expanded into a maritime empire. So they expanded into parts of Samoa, they expanded into Fiji, and this was based again on the second dynasty. Once they took power, they thought, okay, it's time to grow. And so for about 400 or 500 years, they went pillaging. They were somewhat similar to the Vikings, quick strikes. And that's a very fascinating part of my history to me. I don't know all of it, but it is a very interesting part, just particularly because it's something that's, in some communities, Samoans and Tongans still have some kind of animosity towards each other. It's more specifically with the old folks, and that might be more lingering attitudes from over 600 years ago. You know, it's kind of silly, but
hold a grudge.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, exactly. And so that dynasty lasted well into the 19th century, and in the 19th century, that particular dynasty fell off, and the current dynasty, Tu'ikanokopolu, which is a combination of some chiefly titles from Samoa. That's been happening forever. But now the Tu'ikanokopolu is the current dynasty that is in power, and there are about seven kings in.
Oh, okay.
How long has that been?
This particular dynasty?
Yeah.
So we're talking about 1800s, late 1800s.
Wow.
And the last 3 kings have been only in the past 10 years.
Wow.
And that's just because it was a quick. One king was barely in power for barely 6 years. I think he had some health issues. So that was just kind of crazy. Yeah.
Wow, now I'm like intrigued about all
I know.
of this.
So how do you know so much history? I mean, it's interesting because for me, I'm American, Japanese American, but I don't know any Japanese history. Very little to none. And so it's very impressive. Did you learn it while you were there, or did you decide to study it and continue studying it?
That's a great question. I actually learned a lot of it while I was there. Tongan culture, similar to a lot of Polynesian cultures like Samoan, Hawaiian, we're very oral storytellers, and so we're big time storytellers. A lot of that responsibility was actually the mom's responsibility. Culturally, in Tonga, the mothers were the ones who were charged with teaching, imparting culture, things like that to their children. So there's a lot of gender roles, and so all folks were kind of defined by what role they had based on their genders. So I learned a lot of it through storytelling with just mom, and I always had an affinity for good stories. And not just the Tongan stuff. Three Little Piggies, I remember, was my favorite story when I was a kid. And the way my mom used to tell it, she wouldn't read it out of a book. She would like kind of play it out. You know what I mean? So she would like pull this blanket over me, and I remember very distinctly, pull this blanket over me and would act out the wolf, little piggy, and I'm sitting there under the covers like shivering, you know what I mean?
Nice.
And so it was a very interactive storytelling that my mom really instilled in me, and I think I've enjoyed storytelling ever since.
Nice.
And so, like I said, Three Little Piggies so it means I loved all stories, Tongan, the Three Little Piggies, and all the Western stuff, Berenstein Bears, and all those.
Have you? I was going to ask you. So was your mother political?
By virtue of how her parents raised her, yeah.
Okay.
She was always very vocally supportive of the Democratic Party in Tonga, and there's a very specific party in Tonga, the People's Democratic Party of Tonga.
Nice.
And for years, this one gentleman, Akirisi Pohiva, was their party's leader, even though there was like 3 members of the party. People, I think, exactly, you got to start somewhere, but I think people were so supportive of the royal family, and that's, like I said, we're talking about thousands of years of attitude towards the monarchy or even a king in general, right? And so you don't just forget all that in like a few years. And so with that said, I think a lot of people were scared to outwardly be vocal, or at least outwardly be supportive of something like democracy. A lot of pieces of it should favor working class citizens, right? And there's a lot of working class citizens in Tonga. I mean, and so my mom, along with my family, they've always been vocal about things. And this traces back to Christianity and how it even swept across our islands. Methodists were really the ones who took over most of our islands. Catholics came later. My family converted Catholic like at the tail end of when the Methodists were kind of taking over the rest of the islands. And that even has some impact on how political alliances or parties are kind of drawn today. Most of the royal family is Methodist. Most of my family is Catholic. So there's a little bit of that in how people are vocal too, So like I said, my mom has always been very vocal. Very respectful she recognizes the importance in how people revere royalty and the nobility, and she is too, but she will not break her back to give them stuff just because they're royal family, And that's an attitude I think a lot of American-born Tongans are kind of taking on too, just because they didn't grow up in Tonga, and so there's that little bit of reverence for something like a king that doesn't necessarily affect your lives here. That's not present all that much, So yeah.
Dang. We could talk about this for hours.
I know.
Well, I'll just go back to coming here to the United States, right? And so for 14 years, I grew up in Tonga. I grew up speaking both English and Tongan.
Wow.
And And so I think that really helped my transition, at least in some sense. But it also kind of made me invisible also. And by that I mean, because the language itself was not an issue for me, people just kind of assumed I was like a second or third generation immigrant. And so my issues weren't as important. Coming here, the social awkwardness of being a teenager on top of being an immigrant, all of that was made very, very apparent in high school, especially, right? Teenagers are so kind of, it's a weird and cruel, you know?
Yeah.
And so I was, it's, go ahead. What
No,
were you
I was
saying?
I was just telling someone today, like, teenagers are the worst. Like, they're so mean.
They're mean. Middle school to teens,
Yeah.
And you're awkward. You feel awkward too, so it's all bad.
Oh yeah, for sure. I even remember just walking down the hallway and for the first time ever seeing two people make out in the middle of the hallway. And I'm like, they're tripping.
What school was this?
This was in Kent Junior High, which is now Mill Creek Middle School.
Oh.
Yeah.
Kent Junior High had a reputation.
Vandals.
Yes,
KJH Vandals.
They was so bad they closed it down.
Exactly.
They rebranded.
Right. It was so bad they had to rebrand. I went to
we're
Meeker.
getting rid of junior highs.
Right,
We're making this
they
a
were
middle
like-
school.
And it's gonna and the new one is
high.
called Mill Creek.
It's not even close.
It sounds polite. It sounds
Mill Creek or Middle?
Mill Creek.
Mill Creek Middle School.
That's weird. Like Mill Creek, the city.
Right.
all.
Right. How
Exactly. How do you get Mill Creek?
How they got there, I don't know. But they were like, look, they were the Kid Junior High Vandals. Like their mascot was there.
So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Absolutely.
Got it.
Absolutely.
Got it.
Absolutely. And so wait, so you were ninth grade.
Ninth grade, exactly.
Ninth grade.
Yeah.
Oh. And since it was Kent,
Yeah.
Kent was 7, 8, 9
Yeah.
at the time.
Yeah.
So it was still middle
Exactly.
school. Wow.
Yeah. hmm
Wow.
And Tonga's academic calendar year starts in February and ends in November or December, I think.
Okay.
And so even that was like, I came actually halfway through my ninth grade year in Tonga. And so
you
I
were
had to
supposed to be
restart it, so I had to restart pretty much because September is when, or August is when the school year starts here.
Yeah.
So that was interesting as well. Math,
Right.
English, it's
Right.
all very different.
What made your family move?
Great question. So, like I said, my dad was out of the picture before I was born. He had maintained contact all those years after supporting his family, and for a few years, he had found, another woman. And so my mom pretty much took care of me for the first 14 years. And then at 14, she actually came here in 96 for the holidays. Because we have family here in Seattle, right? And so she came to visit them. And it was just by chance that she actually ran into her ex-boyfriend from high school here in Seattle.
Oh wow.
And in that moment, they decided to get married. And so in
96?
Wait,
in 96,
just-
exactly.
On a whim or?
You know, they dated in
United?
high school, and they were really great, I
Yeah.
guess. And then he left Tonga in like 88 or something like that. Or I don't know. It's a long history, long ago history, but I'm not too sure of the details. But main point is, he came out here, had a family, had 3 kids of his own. They're all about my age. So my stepsister is about my age. There's another stepsister who's 31, I believe, and then I have a stepbrother who's just turned 27.
Okay.
And so he had 3 kids of his own. 96, my mom and him rekindled. She came back and said, "Hey, son, we're going to the United States." I'm like, "All right, mom, sounds good. That's cool."
So you were okay with it? You're like, okay.
You know, I grew up always knowing that Tonga was not going to be my home.
Wow.
Yeah,
okay.
I knew that for a fact.
How did you know that?
Tonga's real small,
Okay.
and I can't explain it necessarily in words, but I had always liked my trips to New Zealand because I had family my grandparents moved to New Zealand, and they lived there, and I even spent time back and forth between New Zealand and Tonga. And I think from a very early age, I liked traveling, so even going on planes was really cool to me. How big New Zealand was compared to Tonga was always very appealing. And so I think that was instilled very early, and I always go, I'm not going to live in this country. I love where I'm from. I'm proud of where I came from, where my roots are. But I just knew that my life would be elsewhere,
Interesting.
and it happened to be in the United States, and so yeah,
Nice.
yeah.
Where's Tonga in comparison to New Zealand?
Very good question. So New Zealand is in the southern hemisphere of the Pacific Ocean. Tonga would be, I don't know necessarily in miles, but it's about 3.5 hours northeast of New Zealand. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So it's actually more like 3 hours. It's not that far.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
Interesting. When's the last time you went back? And how often do you go back?
Very good question. 2011 was the last time I went back to Tonga. Before that, it was 2004. So I'm guessing that might be the pattern. It's like every 8 years or
Yeah.
so.
Okay.
So
Okay.
it's coming up. Yeah.
So it's
Yeah,
coming
yeah,
up
you
pretty
almost
soon.
do. You
Yeah,
almost
exactly,
do.
exactly. And I think
Got
this
it.
time around, I gotta take my wife,
Nice.
and she'll
Nice.
see the homestead and everything I did when I was a kid.
That's
Yeah.
legit.
So when your mom told you you're coming to America,
hmm
did you know anything about the Pacific Northwest or?
No, I did not know anything about Seattle. My experience with the United States was the Bay Area, San Francisco. That's where my mom's sister lives, and that's where we visited the first time I came to the United States. I came to the United States in, what was it, 94, I think. We came straight to the Bay Area. I liked it. Mom didn't quite like it, because I think we were already considering a move to the United States at that point, I guess. Well, she was considering it, but that trip to the Bay Area totally turned her off to the
Oh,
U.S.
no.
Never mind.
altogether.
Change her
For some
mind.
reason, I don't know, something about the Bay Area she didn't like.
So we stopped.
No, I'm not trying to throw shade at the Bay Area.
I almost told a joke. I was like,
I like the Bay Area, like I
we
said.
stopped in Richmond. Shout out to Richmond.
Well, maybe it was just where we were, where my aunties were. But yeah, 94 we came. She didn't like it. And then 96 when she came back to visit my family in Seattle. That was her first time in Seattle too.
Oh, okay.
Seattle's climate is very, very different from Tonga. Tonga
bet.
is very dry, dry heat. And I grew up actually a very sickly asthmatic kid.
Okay.
And so every other week I was like rushed to the hospital because I didn't have the little
Inhaler?
albuterol inhaler.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't have that. I don't know why I didn't have that. We could have gotten it. I'm not sure. But we rushed to the hospital every other week because I was having attacks. And I kind of tend to believe that it was probably the weather. And then when we came here in '97, I haven't been sick ever since. And
Really?
I think this rain and the Northwest climate, I think, has really been good for my lungs. So,
Oh, wow.
like, yeah, this is a sign.
I like
I
it
think you
here.
should stay here.
Yoshi, do you have asthma?
No.
Well, I do. Shout out to asthma.
I mean, not that I know of. I would know, right?
I feel the
Right.
pain, bro.
See,
I feel it.
I used to have asthma attacks as a kid, and I had like the it was like called a nebulizer.
That's the one that I kept
It's
going
so
through.
terrible.
What's the nebulizer?
It's like the little.
It's terrible. It's like a machine that you like have to put up to your mouth, and it gets like smoke. It's terrible. My brother and sister used to make fun of me so much.
It's like this blue little contraption about the size of a VCR, hooked to a mask that goes straight to your face, and it just blows like this vaporizing
So when
smoke.
do you use it?
When you
When
have
you
an
have
asthma
an
attack.
Oh, okay.
Yo, it's
so it's
real.
not just like at night when you go to sleep. It's like, no, when you're having asthma.
When you have
Nah.
asthma attacks,
Okay.
you use that thing.
Usually it entails you waking up in the middle of the night and your
Man,
parents
I
not
knew how to
being
set
able
the whole
sleep.
thing up by myself.
After a few days, my parents were like, "Yo, we're not getting up." Yo, hey, get in there and get on that nebulizer.
You know how to do it.
You know how to do it now. All right. Damn.
Oh, memories. Oh
Yo,
my gosh.
that's hilarious.
See, we had to rush to the hospital
Oh yeah,
several times, and before my auntie in the Bay Area actually bought one and sent it back home to us.
just like
And then yeah.
nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, I have to ask my parents, and I'm sure my father will listen to this, but I have to ask my parents how long it took them before it was like, all right, here you go. My brother, it's weird. My brother never used a nebulizer, but he still uses an inhaler for running. I think after a while, I just stopped using the inhaler. And my asthma got a little better. I have no idea why, but
Well, a lot of people who have it as kids tend to grow out of it. You know what I mean? I think asthma is more problematic when people get it later on in their adulthood.
right.
My uncle two of my uncles have developed asthma, and it's really tough for them because they used to be very athletic, and so they're used to being active, and they just hate it.
Oh no! Could have been in the NBA, but I had asthma. Help me down. Help me down. So you come to Seattle.
I come to Seattle.
Your asthma clears up.
Asthma clears up. It's a sign, and I went straight to Kent Junior High.
Okay.
Shout out to the Vandals, no longer around.
R.I.P.
I'd have to say all of high school, including KJH and Kent Meridian High School, where I went after. I don't have very pleasant memories of high school. Not like it was like super traumatic, or not that I was bullied or anything, but the experience of being lonely and I think feeling invisible was the traumatic part for me. And I think that's really what I would say about my whole immigrant experience those first 4 or 5 years here in the States. It's just feeling like no one knew what the heck a Tongan was. No one really cared. People were kind of curious here and there, but curious to the point where they can identify something that they can latch their mind on. Oh, like Hawaii. Oh, like hula. You guys do hula, right? So then they stop caring after that point.
So there wasn't a big community.
No.
In the high school or in the Kent area.
Yeah, Kent area especially. There was not a big Tongan community at that point. Okay. That's not the case today.
Interesting.
It is not the case today. There's a lot of Samoans and a lot of Tongans out in the Kent area. And I think that's reflective of gentrification in the Seattle area, because South Seattle used to have a lot of Tongans and Samoans. And the more recent years after 2000, that changed. And so a lot of my families have moved south into Federal Way, Kent, Tacoma. So they're no longer in Seattle.
Okay, yeah. So I grew up in South Seattle, and I remember going to school with a lot of Pacific Islanders. And, I work with the high schools now, and I don't see as many.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
Okay, so that's why they're moving more south.
We're moving south, Federal Way. Like I said, rent's too high out here.
It's too damn high.
Too damn high.
So when did you discover art?
That's a great question. Art has been in my life since I can remember. Okay. I explained earlier that my mother was a very interactive storyteller, and that included the art piece. So sometimes, and so just to make sure, Three Little Piggies again was my favorite stories, right? Yeah. I'm saying it was my real favorite. Okay. So instead of just acting it out, that wasn't enough. She had to draw that stuff out. I want to see it in drawing. I want to see all of that. So Mom even took out the pen and paper and she drew out the story as it was happening. Nice. And I think at that early stage in my life, I think I was 4 or 5. I picked up what she was doing and just kind of copied it. And I never stopped doing it ever since. Definitely. So I think as far as artists are concerned, I think everyone's an artist. Some folks just tend to nurture that part of themselves for way longer than others. Some people find different interests, and that's okay. But we're all artists, I think, in my opinion.
I just can't draw. I feel like I'm an artist, but drawing is not my...
art comes in many forms. My good friend.
This is true. I used to write 16.
With the drawing, like I said, I picked it up when about 4 or 5, and I never put it down. And even throughout my experience, and that's been the one constant thing, actually. Whenever I drew, I was consistently supported by strangers left and right. Wow. In my whole school experience, like, oh, you're good. Nice. Can you do this one for me? And so, I had ample opportunity to just keep practicing, keep doing it, and I loved it. And people kept affirming that, oh yeah, that's good. That's pretty good. You should keep doing it. And so, again, I think it's part of art is the opportunity to affirm that it's good, and to keep practicing. I think is an important piece as well. And so. I had ample opportunity to keep practicing and be affirmed that it was good, and so I've never stopped doing it ever since. That is awesome. And so today I still do it with I'm on Instagram. Yes. 8 boulders.
Yes. So the number 8.
The number 8.
Boulders.
The word
like
boulders.
Yes. Rocks.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm looking at your Instagram page right now. I see you do shoes as well. What kind of mediums or materials do you use?
That's a great question, because the honest truth is I like all of it. Oh, okay. But my main mediums that I use are Sharpies. I love Sharpies. Nice. There's something about the finality of putting down that thick black line. They're like, yeah, that's tight. That's dope. I like that.
I guess going back a little, how did you get to UW and why UW?
So when I came here in 97, like I said, my experience was more or less about just kind of feeling invisible, both in the academic environment at school, just because people didn't really know what that was, and even at home to an extent. And I'm not trying to throw shade on my family or anything, but you know, it's difficult for any step family to for any family to integrate a stepchild, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that was really the difficulty that I had at home, is kind of figuring out exactly how I fit into a family that was already established. Mm-hmm. I'm not blood relative, but you're all my age, but now you had to call me your brother. Mm-hmm. I didn't know how to react to my stepdad as my dad now. So I think that in that age, I think was pretty tough. And so with that all kind of culminating to just not really seeing myself going beyond high school. And that kind of changed 2 years, about a year after I graduated in 2001 from Kent Meridian. I was still undocumented at that point. We had came here on a visitor's visa. We overstayed it. And we had immediately applied for residency based on my mom's marriage to my stepdad. Mm-hmm. So that process took a total of about 7 years, and it wasn't until 2003 that I actually got my papers. But in that time between 01 and 03, my mom had taken part of this community corrections course at South Seattle Community College through their New Holly campus in South Seattle. And the instructor there, Joe Garcia, was actually like this really bubbly personality, really infectious laughter, and he had this insistence on following up with my mom for some reason. And so because of that, she linked me up with him. I took part of his class as well. And from there, he kind of put the idea of, you should do college. I'm like, huh? Like, you should try to do university. I'll link you up with somebody. And long story short, he linked me up with someone in the recruitment unit at UW. Oh, okay. And so that was my first experience with someone there. And so when I met up with him, he told me, and I was already considering the Art Institute at that point, just to kind of, carry on that skill. But Art Institute is so expensive. Sorry. But it's so expensive. And so but when I met up with him, he said, if we do this, I need you to commit only to the University of Washington. And so I was like, okay, sounds good. And so from there, he helped me with my essays, linked me up with the local PI community organizations at University of Washington, so Polynesian Student Alliance. So that was my first foray into that world. And it wasn't until then that I really felt affirmed, okay, being Tongan is okay.
Nice.
Right. And so I think it kind of came full circle, that having that experience in high school, feeling invisible, to coming to UW and finding a community of folks who you are fully, comprehensively is okay. You should not leave any of that at the door.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's go ahead, sorry.
I was gonna say, so it took about 6-7 years for that. Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm. And so it took 6-7 years, and it was like, and I came into the PI student orgs, and they helped me through that process. I wasn't immediately admitted. I was actually kind of denied, and it was real heartbreaking. But that community again took me under their wing, and did the appeals process, and it worked. Wow. Right, and so the appeals process got in 03, and the rest is history, pretty much. So it was a long, arduous journey, but I think coming to UW couldn't have come at a better time, just because, it just kind of reaffirmed of why it's okay to be who you are.
Yes.
Yeah.
Your art in college, how did you did your art change, or how did you see it flourish when you got to UW?
Let's see. I think the one consistent thing in everything I've been doing as far as art's concerned since I was a kid is just a lot of lines. That evolved eventually in college into my love for Sharpies, right? In high school, I did a lot of pencil. And so I did a lot of portraits of like Tupac and all these just stuff people asked me to draw for them, right? Cars, rappers and things like that. And then actually high school, my senior year was when I started getting to Sharpies, really. Because that's right around the time Star Wars Episode 1 came out, right? And Darth Maul was such a big, he's visually striking character, right? He's a visually striking character with this badass weapon, and so I was like so intrigued by how he looked and how mean he looked and things like that. So I drew that all over the place, and people were like, "Oh, dude, can you draw Darth Maul for me on my yearbook?" And so that there's like
your signature.
There's so many different yearbooks from the 2001 Chem reading class with Darth Maul. Because that was all me, exactly. And so I think from there, I just kept buying Sharpies. And when I got to college, the Polynesian Student Alliance, which I joined that same year that I got in there, asked me to do the T-shirt designs for their annual Polynesian Day performance, right? And so for about 6 years, I designed those T-shirts at UW. Yeah, it's because like, oh, this guy's good. We're gonna ride him for as long as we can.
That's it.
You don't charge, yep.
Like, yeah, you doing the T-shirts forever.
Right.
And so in college, I think it really kind of took on a different. It evolved into the more finer details with lines, and so. In addition to Sharpies, I bought like those Micron pens with the .005 tips, and I think I really enjoyed the meticulousness of putting detail on paper with those pens, and so that took it a different direction, right? And so today, I've dabbled with paint, watercolor, putting it on shoes, trying to write, just like stories.
Nice.
Like I said, I love stories, and so I've been trying to write a lot of what I remember growing up, and I've been writing a series of Maui stories.
Wow.
Now that Moana's super popular, I've been writing this series of Maui stories for the past 10 years and constantly revising them. And now that Moana's so big, I'm like, oh, it's about time to put these out, right?
No, there's a market. There's a market
now. There's a niche, there's a need for it.
That's awesome.
But yeah, my art, I think, has kind of, it's all really about just creativity and just kind of creating content, especially content that speaks to my heritage from Tonga. And I'm trying to figure out how to work my experience as a American as well. Because I've recently owned that title, Tongan American. I've never thought of myself as that, but I am. I very much am. So,
That's true.
Yeah. Changing gears.
Yeah.
What have you been listening to lately?
I grew up. So this is funny because a few years ago on the radio, these Eagles songs it was like Best of Eagles or something like that, and somehow I know, why do I know this tune? Wait, why do I know these words? Wait, what the heck? So I kind of dug back into it, and I know a lot of these old stuff because my mom played that stuff around the house when I was a little kid running around the house. And so I really like the Eagles. I've been listening to them a lot. I really like Bee Gees.
Nice.
I like this old stuff.
Nice.
Right? So a lot of the 70s funk, I really like it. This band Dynasty, I think, from the 70s.
Okay.
There's a kind of a disco feel. Bill Withers, I really like him.
Bill Withers.
Yeah. A lot of that old, all those old love songs, Lenny Williams and all that. I really like that sound, like that era of R&B.
Nice.
Moving into the 80s, I enjoy the 80s too, with all the synth heavy stuff. Not so much the rock, but more the pop type stuff. So the Jets, right? The Jets in the 80s, they're Tongan.
Yeah. Oh, are they?
Yeah.
Oh, for some reason I thought they were Filipino.
No, they're Tongan. Yeah.
Wow.
They are Tongan.
So were they big?
They were huge in Tonga.
Nice.
That's awesome.
Huge.
Did they ever play? Did they ever go back and do concerts? You
They didn't. So they were supposed to come back to Tonga for a concert, but they canceled. People were livid. They were
They're
so
right.
upset.
They were
so upset.
I didn't know
They
that.
were so upset. People were so upset. But yeah, the
so
Jets are
cool.
Tongan, and they've done a reunion tour recently, and a lot of Tongans have gone to that.
Has there been any other Tongan groups since, or
No,
artists,
they
actor,
are
musicians?
the biggest that Tongans have ever taken it in the music industry.
Listen,
I like them though. I like
love
them.
the Jets.
I gotta do my Googles.
I thought they were Filipino. I knew they weren't like white or black or Latino, So I was like, oh, they're Filipino. I don't know why. I'm sorry. That's so cool.
Yeah.
Learning something. I mean, I learned a lot today, but
So the
okay.
Jets, and so a lot of that kind of sound
Yeah.
that the Jets had.
Yeah.
As I enjoy that. And in the '90s, of course, you have the R&B of the '90s. R&B of the
Yes.
90s, you know, Joe and Casey and JoJo and all that. Yeah. And recently, I've also what I've listened to a lot in my office at work is a lot of UB40. So that's kind of what the radio played a lot when I was a kid growing up in Tonga. So we played a lot of UB40, and that's kind of my security, my safety, my safety music. Like, yeah, this is
Toka had
this is
jams.
safe.
My office was next to Toka's. And I was like, yo, Toka's over here jamming.
Nice. So, is there any growing up? Was there any? Oh, because you're saying the Jets and UB40s. It's very Western music,
Yeah.
right? Was there any
Tongan?
local, that were like really big, or was it very Western influenced?
It was very Western influenced, but Tonga had its music, of course.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I didn't appreciate it until later. You know what I mean? So I think until I left the islands and actually got into college and been away from that music for as long as I was, and then listening to it again, kind of understanding the lyrics a little differently. A lot of Tongan music is written very metaphorically, because you can't speak straight Tongan or like very everyday Tongan and write that into a song. It just doesn't make sense. It sounds weird. I've heard it before. Like, yeah, this sounds weird. You have to write it metaphorically, because that's the way Tongan music has to be written. That's my opinion. And so when I started listening to it again, I really appreciated it a lot more. And then I even asked questions to my mom, like, what do these lyrics mean? Like, who wrote these? Like, yeah, that's actually your uncle. Like, oh, what?
Oh, look at you, artists in the family.
There's all this self-exploration and kind of rediscovering, like, oh, dang, this song is much closer to me than I ever thought it was. You know, so there's definitely a lot of that, and I think I enjoy listening to some of this stuff. It's funny because I think back to when my mom would switch it to these old Tongan songs on the radio. I'm like, this is boring music. But now I listen to it, I'm like, yeah, I like this.
This is it. But we will let you go. Can you give us a quick drop?
Yeah.
So again, thank you for having me. This is Toka Valu. My Instagram is 8boulders. You can check out a lot of my art there. And you have been listening to the No Blueprint podcast. Thank you.